Good afternoon, dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you on our panel discussion that is part of the Forum 2000, discussion about China and Chinese foreign policy, which is fittingly called China Expansion Abroad. The era of the rule of current Secretary General and President Xi Jinping is characterized by two major trends: the strengthening of control within China and the political and economic expansion into the world. For example, One Belt, One Road initiative. How are these two trends related and how do they affect China and the rest of the world, of course? These are the questions for my panelists, for my speakers, and we are going to talk about them. But before we will start our debate, let me introduce our panelists, dear guests from Taiwan, Vietnam, India, Spain, and Czech Republic. So the first speaker that I would like to represent is a Mr. Jagannath Panda, if I'm right, research fellow and head of the East Asia Center of Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, author of India-China Relation, Politics of Resources, Identity and Authority in Multipolar World Order. In addition, Mr. Panda is a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Asia Public Policy and is the first South Asia scholar to receive the prestigious East Asia Institute Fellowship for 2016. Welcome, Mr. Panda.
Thank you.
Next speaker is coming, he's not escaping from us. Mr. Juan Pablo Cardenal is a journalist and writer focusing on China's global strategy. He is co-author of two books about China, The Silent Chinese Conquest and China's Silent Army, if I'm right. The translation was...
Not exactly, but...
Then we will
fair
put
enough.
it. Thank you. And he also contributes to several international media. He's a former China correspondent for Spanish economic daily El Economista and El Mundo. Welcome as well.
Thank you.
My next panelist is Mr. Xu Jianhu, president of Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. There's Xu worked before for an Institute of Political Science at Academia Sinica in Taipei and was a director of the Center for Contemporary China at National Tsinghua University. Dr. Xu obtained a doctoral degree at Columbia University in New York. Welcome as well.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Mr. Xiao Chang, founder and editor-in-chief of China Digital Times, a bilingual news website. He's an adjunct professor at the School of Information and the Graduate School of Journalism at the University of California, Berkeley. He's also the principal investigator of the Counterpower Lab, an interdisciplinary faculty-student research group focusing on technology and free flow of information in the cyberspace. Our last guest that I didn't have a chance to welcome is Mr. Nguyen Hoa Cha, if that is the right, a computer scientist, a former businessman, and full-time critic of the communist government in Vietnam. He also launched an appeal to Vietnamese citizens to exercise their right to stand for election in the National Assembly election of May 2016. So welcome all of you. And finally, let me introduce myself. I'm a Czech journalist. I was based for the last 10 years in China, in Beijing, Taipei, and Hong Kong, covering news in Asia with main focus on China. This year I moved from public media into the, I would say, more academic sphere, and I am part of the team of the web media called Synopsis. The recent events in Hong Kong were the last and maybe strongest occasion that let me think a lot about the importance of democracy. Also the anniversary of Tiananmen Square massacre, the regime in China led by the Communist Party seems to have managed to overcome all serious threats, I would say, and spreading communist idea and style to the other region, to Hong Kong, for example, but also to the Central and Eastern Europe. So my first question to our panelists is, how would they describe China these days? Is it word is it a threat or success? So let me give you a chance to start, Mr. Panda, please.
Yeah.
Each panelist has 3 to 5 minutes.
Thank you. It's a big question whether China is a world threat or a success. Simply, it's at this moment probably we cannot call China a world threat, simply for a reason because China comes as an opportunity for many countries. Be it smaller countries or for bigger countries, China is still an opportunity in many sense. Whether we can call China a success, I don't really think so. The Chinese economy has substantially done well. China has become a global phenomenon, but the Chinese model has not been accepted. So whether really we can call a Chinese model or China's rise as a success, it's really premature to say. But in my opinion, what is really apparent at this moment is that I think there is a debate evolving about China's rise, Chinese model, and the survival of the Communist Party. And therefore, I think the most interesting point, what we need to really talking about is that the China we are talking about, whether it is coming as a concern or as a box of opportunities which is going to expand further and the world is going to capitalize on that opportunity to get the benefits. I think to me, from where I do see, from the neighboring land of China, I do see China as a concern. And this is for 3 specific reasons. One, I think there is a party which is ruling China for last 6-7 decades. And the party survives on the very basis of communism, which is very much a manipulated form of communism. We know that I think world has debated enough about the forum of communism. And communism as an idea, as an ideology, still exists very much. And I think benefits of communism is immensely felt around the world because it really talks about the poor people. But we have a communist model in our democratic society, near the Democratic Society of India, that doesn't really care for the poor. That doesn't really care for the millions of the Chinese which are still under poverty. There is a regional gap is expanding within China. There is a huge gap between the urban China and the rural China. Most importantly, what is really worrisome, at least from the neighboring point of view, is that the perverted form of communism that is surviving within China is coming as a concern to the neighboring countries, not only towards India, but also to a range of countries in the neighboring regions. And that, for me, is a matter of concern. So we cannot really call China a world success at this moment. Neither, apparently, we can call it a threat, because still the Chinese are not in a position to pose an outright threat. But just to extend a little bit my point here, that why I do really call China as a concern, I think there are other regions, apart from the idea of communism, which is surviving within China, which is really worrisome. And it is emerging as a concern, and in future, it might turn into a threat. There are 2 additional regions. The second point is, in addition to the point of the survival of communism, the second point is this: the kind of communism is emerging in China today is completely different from the communism what Mao Zedong really thought about. It is a communism which is trying to imprint everything, both from the democratic world and from the non-democratic world. And it is a communism which is really having a mask in it, which is trying to grab a whole lot of opportunities, not only in the neighboring regions, but also far across the regions around different corners of the world, be it the land territorial opportunities or the maritime opportunities. For example, if we talk about China, China is having still a large number of territorial expansion, territorial conflicts in the neighborhood regions. If we talk about the maritime issues, China is still one of those countries which has the maximum number of maritime disputes with the neighboring countries. So for me, these are the emerging concerns which the world really needs to talk about. The third point, what I really do see, and that for me, that's why the China comes as a concern, and in future it will turn as a threat probably, and therefore I will not really back the Chinese model of communism or Chinese model of growth story as a success. The third point is, I think China has failed to take everybody along with him, especially the smaller countries and the neighboring countries. If we talk about China's foreign policy in the immediate regions, I think even the smaller countries, be it in South Asia or in Central Asia, they're still with the Chinese model of growth, and they're still supporting China's rise. And today, what we see, the One Belt, One Road initiative or the Belt and Road initiatives, most of these countries are on a face value supporting China's Belt and Road initiatives. But still, if we see, none of these countries so far has signed any substantial agreements or understandings or memorandum of understandings which would really back the Chinese model of communism and Chinese model of growth story. And let me give you a precise example of this. I think if you see, do a survey, none of these smaller countries around China, be it in the South Asian countries, in the Southeast Asia or Central Asian countries, they all have their bilateral understanding and agreements with China. But none of these countries have come on a grouping basis or in a multilateral forums to sign anything substantial which will promote China's One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road initiatives. So therefore the concern rises. And with regard to India, I think we are the only country, we are the only democratic society which have challenged the Chinese model of communism, Chinese model of Belt and Road initiatives, and Chinese model of growth story. If you see the May Belt and Road initiative in Beijing, India was the only country, India was the only major country. Of course, Bhutan is another country which did not really participate. But India is the only major country which decided not to attend the Belt and Road initiative in Beijing in this May. And that has actually set an example in the international forums. And that has, in fact, I do not have much doubt to say in this forum that in future, this will be one of the talking points that why India did not really support China's One Belt, One Road initiatives. We do have a lot of agreements with the Chinese. We do have sister city engagement. We do have sister provincial engagement. We do have a trade and healthy trade and economic contacts with the Chinese. But when it comes to the Belt and Road initiative, we did not support it simply for a reason, because the Belt and Road initiative comes from an unilateralism, from a unilateral initiatives of China, which is based on an authoritarian framework of initiatives. And therefore, I think we can talk about China's rise in a broader sense, but when it comes to the Chinese model of growth story, and if we go into the details, the way they try to expand their foreign policy initiatives along with the domestic initiatives, that comes as a concern. At this moment, probably we cannot say that the Chinese model is a threat, but definitely it's a concern, and the world needs to really note about that seriously. I'll stop here and maybe later on.
Thank you. Mr. Carnell, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm just going to try to stick to the 3-4 minutes. Just maybe 3 ideas I want to mention. First, from my experience being a journalist in China and then following what China is doing abroad for so many years, my first perception that I want to share with you is that we need to get used to the idea that China is not going to become a democracy or anything like that. This is something that probably before 2008, at least when I was living in China, it was common to hear from different people that it was just a matter of time, that China needed to develop economically before it could think of doing a political reform. Well, I had doubts already at that time from what I could see or experience. And now after the crisis, after the 2008 crisis, I think it's impossible. We are not going to see that. And I think it's impossible first because the Communist Party doesn't have an incentive to do so. It's a party that decisions are made through, it's a deliberative party, so it's not one person you would need someone with a lot of charisma to push a decision like that all the way, and it's most probably would face a lot of resistance. So I think, in this sense, it's going to be difficult. Then I think the rest of the world, we had some leverage in the past to try to influence China on this, and we missed all the opportunities that we had at the time when China was on this process of opening and reform, when they joined the WTO, and there was, I think, 16, 17 years of negotiation. This political agenda, those political reforms were never in the agenda. And then the final thing was the Olympics. So I don't think that at this point, and more than that, after 2008, with the weakness of the rest of the world and China having been able to bypass fairly well the crisis, I don't think we have any influence at all. And probably the most important one is the fact that the Chinese leadership doesn't believe that the Western model is suitable for China. I don't think that I think they believe that the Chinese model is the model that suits best China. You know, I think they are very clear about that. And again, after the crisis in which the reputation of the West really fell in the eyes of the Chinese, I think they are more clear, and there's been many examples that lead us on this direction. So one thing that we need to ask ourselves is that with that China, if that is like that, if we're going to be dealing with a country that is not a country open to transparency, participation, where the people have so a government supported by the people, etc., we need to ask what kind of behavior such a country, such a powerful economic country, will have, in particular in the region. You know, we always talk about the South China Sea tensions, but we are seeing the problems with South Korea very recently, with India historically, the same with Japan. How will China react to all of this? This is something that we need to keep in mind. Second idea is I've been following China abroad in roughly 40 countries during the last 7 years. Most of them trying to, in the developing world, trying to see how this internationalization process, how China is doing it, and the impact for the local populations in those countries. And of course, it would be very difficult to give a straight answer to what do I think, but it's definitely mixed. There's some things that are good, but I think the impact for the, I mean, maybe for the elites, if you have a country that comes with a lot of money, is ready to give you a loan, is ready to invest on energy-related projects, so that China can secure its future supplies of natural resources. And then they can bring their companies in that have a lot of experience, the engineering companies and construction companies. And if you need that, you also have the labor force. So if you are part of the political elites of those countries, you definitely love the Chinese, because on top of that, they don't ask controversial questions, etc. But the most important thing after 2008 is that the Chinese are the only ones that have the money, you know. I personally interviewed some of those politicians, and I remember one minister of an African country saying, if I don't build a road, I won't get reelected, and if I build a road, I'm a hero, you know. So I think this shows a little bit the mood among those elites. The problem is the people that are never in the picture are the people that are suffering the side effects of those investments and projects. You know, of course, there's a lot of environmental impact. and social impact in many, many, many places. It's not that I'm cherry picking, you know, and it's common. It has to do with the fact that the Chinese companies, in particular the state-owned companies, there's no social responsibility code of conduct, although it's changing, but it's definitely not enough to filter certain projects. There's no transparency, and the standards are very low. And who are paying the consequences of those low standards? Definitely the weakest people, the people that don't have a voice. In this sense, labor conditions, that's something that I've seen in every single country that I follow the Chinese project. This is a common thing, and I've never understood why this that is hurting China's reputation so much. How come they are not ready to advance the problem and try to solve it? Probably because, again, just to relate to this, they don't the Chinese officials, they never explain what they are doing abroad, which I also think it's a big strategic mistake. They could at least explain the good things that they are doing, which there are plenty of them. But then they don't explain anything, not the good nor the bad things, which probably that shows a little bit the kind of importance that they give to the transparency of their operations in the rest of the world. I'm finishing about the One Belt, One Road. Probably we can talk in the next few minutes. For me, it's I'm still trying to figure out what that is. Honestly, I don't think they haven't explained it properly. For what I can figure out, it's something that they've been doing for the last decade and a half in the neighboring countries. It's exactly the same thing. It's about infrastructure. It's about facilitating trade. It's about having their big companies do projects and make business through infrastructure projects wherever they can do it, and they're going to do it no matter if this initiative goes ahead or not. They're still going to do it. My suspicion is that they are framing this to make it more friendly and to have more political might in the places where they're going to do this project. Just last thing, we can talk it also later. The new thing that I've been researching the last year is a one-year research project in Argentina and Peru on Chinese soft power. And we can, anyone interested, I can give a few details of that. But I just to finish up, I just want to make the point that we are in another level. So before, it was all about the economy. It was all about securing the supplies of natural resources. That is done already. There's no country in the world that doesn't have plenty of Chinese investments or potential Chinese investments. They are moving to another level, which is engaging politically. And what I followed in those countries, and my understanding that in the Latin America region and probably many other places too, they are engaging with politicians, with the media, in order because they want to legitimize their regime, among other reasons.
Thank you. I will just mention that this is not happening just in Africa or Latin America, but also here in Europe, and we are going to talk about it later. So I will give the floor to Mr. Xu, please.
Yes. The title of this panel is Foreign Expansion, China Before the Communist Party Congress. So the question we are asked to answer is whether it's a success or a threat. Is China's foreign expansion a success or a threat? Then my answer is, depends for whom, based on what value. There are three dimensions of China's expansion. We talk about economic a lot, OBOR, but there is also geopolitical and strategic expansion, particularly in East and Southeast Asia. And then there is an ideological expansion. That is also very important. When we talk about China as an alternative model, it's a multi-dimensional model. It's not only military, geopolitical, or strategic, or economic, it's also ideological as an alternative. So, depends on what dimension are we talking about. Should we be against of expanding China's impact? For example, for a lot of small countries, like in this region, when you are lacking of foreign investment, all of a sudden, you have a deep pocket China coming into your country, investing a lot of infrastructure projects. Why should we be object to that? Then you have to think it through. What would the consequences be? Usually, China would say, our project is not like the Western ones. We don't have strings attached to it. So it's not that kind of trouble for you. It's easy, particularly when they are able to buy off some top-ranking officials or parliamentary members to speak for that project. It's even easier, right? So business done in a minute. Is it good or bad? So let's coming back to the strings attached. Why would so many international projects have such a lot of requirement? For example, human rights requirement, environmental requirement, because of the reason that we have to share collective responsibility. So China usually talk about the great rejuvenation of Chinese people. By itself, it may not be bad, but as long as the rejuvenation of human civilization cannot go along with that rejuvenation of Chinese people, then it may not be good. So we have to judge the expansion of Chinese influence according to values. So when China is saying no strings attached, they're saying we don't ask you to share the collective responsibility. Is that good or bad? Isn't that obvious? Let me give you a few examples in Taiwan, because I'm from Taiwan. Okay. So nowadays, a lot of people say, oh, after the DPP or Tsai administration came to power in Taiwan, the relationship between China and Taiwan deteriorated, as if the previous relationship was very good. Okay. In 2014, there was a big social movement in Taiwan called Sunflower Movement. A lot of students and NGOs all of a sudden came to the streets, occupied our parliament for 23 days, not allowing the parliament to function. Why was that? Is that a civic or populist movement? That was the question. The reason for that was the previous Taiwanese government, under the leadership of President Ma, or KMT rulership, they strike a deal with Beijing on the cross-trade service agreement, not informing the society in advance, not only not informing the society, not even informing the same party parliamentary members. So no one knows what was going on. All of a sudden, the government say, we're going to have this trade agreement with Beijing. And everyone say, what? What is that about? That is about service. It affects a lot of small business in Taiwan. Then people say, wow, how come we don't know this? And the government say, well, we just got a deal. So it's a very typical deal that can be done not only in Taiwan, but in a lot of other countries. Then our society started to ask questions, but the government is not willing to answer. So eventually, we have this pushback from the civil society, and eventually, the parliament suspended that agreement until today. So we have to ask the nature of China's expansion. China expansion, as I said, is not only economic one. There is always a political purpose or geopolitical purpose behind that. In our region, you have expansion of China's military existence. On Taiwan, we have this new aircraft carrier, Liaoning, circulating Taiwan, and we don't know why. We did not announce independence or something like that. We don't understand why they circle Taiwan around, although actually I have to say, for aircraft carrier, to be able to fight, you need a group of ships, right? They don't have that yet. So why selling? It costs a lot of energy. It's very costly. And then they have bombers coming from the north to the south, from the south to the north. And we didn't understand why. Then eventually we understood that was not only aiming at Taiwan. It's a maneuver to penetrating the first island chain. There are deeper strategic implications. And the same thing is happening in the South China Sea, pushing ahead. A lot of man-made islands. And then they're exerting their economic influence and the political influence too. So now you have in Philippines, the Philippine president is doing his anti-drug campaign, and the Western countries are criticizing this maneuvering, and then Chinese government giving Philippines government a lot of automatic guns as a gift, to the government in their for whatever purposes. And then because the Philippines government changed the attitude, even after the UN arbitration on the island, changed its position to China. So China has to reward that. So you see this political, economic, and military expansion are working together to, of course, increase the China's influence, but we have to ask the value. Why? For what purpose? So again, coming back to Taiwan's case, the trade agreement, the service trade agreement, originally, according to our precedents of trading agreement with China, the government should consult not only the parliament, but many economic sectors in the society, and to prepare them for coming impact so that an agreement can be signed more smoothly. But the government didn't do that. So that was because of China's direct impact to the very top level of our leadership. That compromises actually the principles of not only transparency, but public accountability. And in some, it's compromising the principle of democracy. And that was the reason why there was a pushback from civil society. Let me give you another example of recent incident. There was a singing contest held in Taiwan, actually in one of the most prestigious campus, National Taiwan University. The original host was actually the propaganda department of Shanghai City. And then that department delegates to some PR firm in Taiwan to host this event. Actually, the similar event have been hosted in many campuses. But now, when they move to the National Taiwan University, which is the most top university, the students there are somehow politically more aware, more sensitive. And there was a pushback from the students asking the university authority why such event is held within the campus without informing the students in advance. And then it turned out that some legislature exerted some pressure on the Ministry of Education in Taiwan, and some official make a phone call to the university advising the university to host such an event. So all this was not made public in advance. So when the student pushed back, then gradually this information were released to the public. So again, an ordinary cultural exchange event should be okay. If it's made transparent and publicly accountable, we don't object that. We should not object that because more cultural exchange will increase the mutual understanding. We should encourage that, but we encourage those events in a democratic way, in a more publicly accountable way, manner, a more transparent manner. So I'm just raising a few examples in Taiwan, and the hope There are lessons that you can learn from these experiences. Again, so coming back to the question, whether it's a threat or it's a success, it depends whether it's in conformity with the basic principles of democracy, transparency, and public accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. I will ask Mr. Nguyen, please.
Okay, I think from a perspective of a Vietnamese, I am going to tell my opinion on the success or threat of the Chinese expansion. I think that economically, the development of China, inside China, in the past 30, 40 years was a very, very success. And its expansion to the outside world is quite understandable effort of the Chinese government. And I think that it can be a great opportunity for its neighbor and for the world at large. If although development or expansion serve the interests of all, though concerned, but I am very afraid that the threat to the neighbor and to the world is much, much bigger. You see, with Vietnam, I think that Vietnam and China, the relation between the two nations was never very good. Huh? And the tension was always. So what I am going to tell you may be a bit biased for that reason. But what we learned from our experience in the past and recently in the past few years was not so good. You see, the Chinese investment in Vietnam are not so big. But you never know that the investment under other ownership like Hong Kong, Singapore, or Virginia Islands is not the Chinese, it's not the mainland Chinese. So sometimes the number tell you not so much, but the experience in daily life can tell you more information, more informative data. In Vietnam, we a lot of infrastructure investment of Vietnamese enterprises, mainly the state-owned enterprises, was won by the Chinese company. Because they bid with a very low price, but after having the contract, they increased the cost by several reasons. And finally, you got a project with very expensive, with bad technology. And I think that I am very afraid that with such a project, Vietnam will be a place to accept Chinese waste in industrial weight. You see obsolete technology, mainly the power station. Okay, the Chinese company, state-owned company, built a lot of a power station in Vietnam with EVN, with the Vietnamese electricity, and thermal. You see, bring in a lot of coal, pollution, and not up-to-date technology. And here, I have to tell you very, very frankly that we Vietnamese, we think that the Chinese company, they are master of bribing, and that they can win very easily a project, and that have a very long term consequences. Then I think it's very negative. You see, the Chinese government or Chinese leadership, they have a very, very clear objective. They don't hide their objective with the Chinese dream. They want to be #1 in the world. You see, economically, not in terms of per capita, but in terms of GDP, gross GDP, they are already #1 if you count it in PPP term. And with that development, they try to expand their strength into neighbor and into the world. The South China Sea problem with Vietnam is very, very delicate, very tense. You see, and the strategy of government of China is that they try to transform a non-disputed issue into a disputed one. And I try to overwhelmingly spread the news into the world and convince everybody that, yes, it is a disputed issue. And that's half of their success already. You see the issue and dispute, the so-called dispute in South China Sea, was not at all a disputed one. And now became a disputed issue. And after that, they occupy several islands, Spratly and Paracel Island, and they build several artificial islands, and they told the world that no, we don't do militarization. Okay, Xi Jinping promised with Obama some time ago that no, it's yes, infrastructure for economic development, but in fact it's military build up on the sea. And I think that's very, very dangerous. Here, you see, concerning the South China Sea issue, I remind you very much that tomorrow, the 10th of October, is a very sad experience of Czech Republic. Czech. You see, in 1938, the world was silent with the expansion of Nazi. And with the agreement of Munich, okay, they forced the Czech to accept the annexation of Sudetenland. And with the consent of a big European power, the Britannia. So we have to learn historical experience and be very, very careful with expansion of the Chinese government. And I think that I have to call your attention on that issue, and I would like very much if the world create an alliance for peace, to prevent inside all such activity of expansion and keep the expansion, the Chinese expansion in the right road to serve the world, not only their ambition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Xiao, please.
I'll try to make my contribution based on previous presenters. The title is right before the Party Congress, 19th Party Congress. And also our moderator laid out that the question of how the domestic trends relating to the foreign policy, the domestic conditions and the foreign policy relations. And the third is that the question has been discussed here, whether the China's expansion, foreign expansion, the success or a threat, right? Take the last one first. A successful threat. Since we're in the Forum 2000, the theme is defending democracy. As our Taiwanese friend said, we have our values. Yeah, universal value, fundamental freedom, human rights, democratic participation, liberal democracy. These are the values we base to describe something. If we're starting from these values, China's expansion is not a success. It's a threat. It's a success in many ways, economically, increasing the social freedom, China as a state that is also a success in the sense of an authoritarian regime adjusted itself that in the 21st century, taking advantage of globalization, etc. There's certain advantage, competitive advantage of the authoritarian regime that in this whole rise of China's story. But it's not a success of democracy. It's a threat to democracy. Then why, when we talk about party congress, we're talking about China as a Leninist party, running still a one-party authoritarian regime. In 21st century, those political systems, there are very few today in the world, has some fundamental challenges, problem. Legitimacy challenge. Yeah. It is not based on elections. It's so the political power has a fundamental legitimacy challenge as a system. And this comes to two levels. One is why China's this whole market-oriented economic growth since the Tiananmen massacre, it was partially or mainly address the legitimacy challenge that to deliver this economic performance, therefore the party justifies itself not by communist ideology, but by the ability, capacity to deliver those economic achievement to the society, which China did succeed to the point, at a huge price of the vulnerable groups and ordinary citizens' human rights, such as labor rights, environment, you name it, freedom of speech. Secondly, this legitimacy question relating to precisely the Party Congress. At the highest level, who controls China? who runs China? Who is the highest leadership? Every authoritarian regime has that fundamental problem, right? You are not a son of an emperor. You are not the oldest son of an emperor. You are not elected by the people. Then why this particular person or this particular group running the country, not the other? The internal politics, by nature, is opaque. It's in the black box. It's non-transparent. It's vicious. It's ferocious. It's full of conspiracies. And it's full of uncertainty. This is the next word I want to put it out here. This uncertainty also threats the world. Yeah. The more powerful China as a state it is, militarily and economically, and the more potential threat this kind of political untransparent uncertainty, decision-making uncertainty to the world. And the potential legitimacy crisis, including the economic slowdowns and the higher power struggle, this uncertainty, what it reflect to? How does it reflect to foreign policy? My sort of observation angle, I'm Chinese, but I grew up in China, but I have left China for a long, long time, more than 28 years. I observe China on the internet. On the internet, I see two things. Right? Nationalism, which is the Chinese state manufactured, highly sort of manipulated phobia of nationalism as part of a source of legitimacy. Another is this extreme anxiety and insecurity suppressing any kind of political information. You cannot believe how fragile they are, as a matter of fact, to see what of a content they're suppressing, what kind of the censorship they're sensitive about, right? What are they really afraid of? On the outside, you see a powerful nation, whatever the GDP becoming number 2 and coming to number 1, and the expansion of the Chinese money and Chinese military and all of that. But if you look at the Chinese social media, look at what censorship is, day and night, every minute going after, you can't believe how insecure this regime is. And that vulnerability also translating to a threat. Yeah. And combination of the nationalism. It could be a threat to the neighboring countries, to the other states. It also can be translated as a deeply sort of uncertain of how the future China transition will be. No matter how powerful economically and politically the sitting there, ask any Chinese leader, if you have a chance to sit down with them honestly, not at a press conference, do you see yourself in 10 years or 20 years? Where China going to be? I tell you, they don't have answer because you know what? Their wife has a whole American passport. Their money is in the Swiss bank. They run China. They took all the resources. They suppressed all the oppositions. They control the country, but they do not have a confidence for the China's future. What does that mean? I'll leave it to the panel.
Thank you. And now I have a few questions. I will address it to one of our panelists. If you would like to add anything, just raise your hand and tell me, and I will give you floor. My question is about, you mentioned insecurity of Chinese regime, but still, how come that this current authoritative regime seems so durable and stable? What are the main pillars of its legitimacy? Mr. Cardinal, maybe can I ask you?
Well, it's commonly been said that the legitimacy that they have is the fact that they are able to give prosperity to the Chinese people. That's why many of the decisions that they make, also abroad, are directly linked with the domestic situation. You know, I mean, I was mentioning before that one of the main drivers of why China has this strategy from the 2001, 2002, this strategy of going global. One of the reasons is, probably the main reason, is to secure the future supplies of natural resources. And the reason is they want to secure them because they don't really trust the market. So they go to the source because they are aware that if something's wrong with that supply, that might have a huge impact in a country who has, in an economy, sorry, that has two of the engines, is China's urbanization, and the other one is the factory of the world. So that explains quite well the fact that they understand that if the economy collapses, they lose this legitimacy. And I think for them, it's their most obvious weak flank. But probably of course, there's other issues that we might consider as being as building up on the legitimacy, like this is the party that unified China, etc. Right? But I would definitely think that the economy is the main factor.
Do you want anyone to add anything?
May I?
Please.
Yes. I don't know if the audience or the panelists were in the previous session when Guo Wengui was talking about princeling capitalism. He has a remark that really strikes me. He said, you know, actually, the expansion we're talking about serves whose interest? Do you know that? You know, that's a very good question. Actually, it's a group of princeling capitalists that actually make the formal institution irrelevant. They are the real kingmaker. They are the real vested interest groups that controls the whole situation. So I think even that is one of the reasons why Xi Jinping himself wants to concentrate so much power in his own hands, because it's difficult even for him to control that group. So when you have investment in your country, are you aware that this investment, this corporation is affiliated with whom? Back to China. Who is that corporation accountable to? You know, actually in China, within that group, no one is accountable to anyone. And that was the reason why Xi Jinping wants to concentrate the power. It's a reflection of lack of accountability. So when internally you have such an opaque and unaccountable mechanism, how can it be accountable overseas? And that is the threat. So coming back to the pillar of legitimacy, when you have a regime like that, think about that. When you have a regime like that, the success of its performance, or particularly the economic performance, hinges on to what extent it monopolizes all the resources and power. The more monopolistic, the more successful it is. And then, when it's so monopolistic, it's not only monopolistic in economic resources, but also in political power, as well as image-making power. The Chinese Communist Party actually invests a lot of money in propaganda, not only domestically, but also internationally. In managing cross-strait relations with Taiwan, invests a lot. The pocket's really deep. There are tens of hundreds of, say, like summer camp for young students, Taiwanese students to go to China. They pay for it. And other kinds of, high-ranking forums, things like that. They pay for it. All of these events are organized to polish the image of the Chinese regime and do the same thing domestically. And they isolate, atomize the domestic opposing forces to make them very fragmented so that they cannot organize them together. And they, as Xiao Qiang and the previous panelists in the previous session said, they also control the media so that no free information can be circulated. So that's the way they control the image of the regime to make it seem very legitimate. We should never underestimate their capacity in doing that.
Thank you. I have one question about the media to Mr. Xiao, but please start, then I will ask Mr. Xiao about the media and current.
You see, the question is on the durability of regime. I think that all autocracy in history, you see, they were quite stable, quite durable, and the Chinese one today is the same. Because I agree with you in terms of controlling media with development of economy, but at the same time, you see, to manipulate the thinking of the mass and to get the mass to be content with the system. That topic is discussed very, very thoroughly by Václav Havel. And I think that not only the mass inside China, but also the international community also appraised the success, the powerful of China. Although contribute to durability of the system. So we have to wake up to see the reality.
That's true. I can go back to the media. When we are talking about the ideology, media, especially media in China, and be particularly hit by Xi Jinping ideology campaign. So how do you see the current state of the freedom of expression on the mainland?
Well, right now is in the most depressive period over the last probably 20-some years. But I'm not simply just describing this in a sort of still perspective. We have seen the more marketing-oriented media reforms since 90s, and also the growth of the internet. Together, a combination of the greater social freedom in order to achieve the economic activities and competitiveness, it's also a side effect, a byproduct of this whole economic growth. Yeah, we don't. It didn't completely overthrow the authoritarian government, but it does expand it to a certain degree, the civic freedom, including the Chinese media, to the point that the greater information is spread inside of China, the greater public opinion being emerged through the social media and on the more liberal side of the media person knows, even they are under the party control. The party felt the threat by the public opinion, and including by its own media, the ones who have a less control margins. That is the reason, context, when Xi Jinping stepped into power, they cracked down on the civil society and the media. It's not only because they have a better control, it's they are threatened by this expanding freedom. I think the threat was real. Right. Even just reading from their own internal speeches, they constantly say, "Oh, the media personnel are more liberal-oriented. They are not buying the party values. They are not. We need to control them." So what you see is what I call the Empire Strike Back. Yeah, this period of time. Yeah, and if you want to see further. The 5 years, 10 years down the road, I would say this kind of a repressive measure cannot last indefinitely. Yeah, the society, including the Chinese media, will push back, and the internet social will push back to another level. Okay? So this back and forth will continue. That being said, I just want to add one more thing. We also do not want to underestimate the capacity of the Chinese Communist Party to adapt and to evolve to the situation to gain the new control. For example, the technology of surveillance, the technology of state to overseeing the citizens, internet users, or any aspect of society. The state gained a whole lot more power this way, and the more desperate they are for their own legitimacy and stability, the more repressive and more sort of effort goes into those kind of repressive and social control measures. So we'll see both sides. We'll see the society pushing back, I have no doubt about it, but we'll see the state also relentlessly keep on the control of the Chinese society. You'll see that it is a dynamic.
I'd like to add something to this media section. One of the findings that, of my last research in Latin America was that I kind of figured out the media strategy that China has, at least in those countries, and I think in some others too. I mean, for them, it's not only about controlling the media inside China, but they're also trying to manipulate the information related to China wherever they can, okay? So let me give you just an example of Argentina, but I insist it could be any other country. They, in the last few years, they've been being able to make deals with the Argentinian TV, the public corporation that owns different media, including the national TV. At this stage, just for, well, it's not just, but it's pretty big, in fact, but it's at this point only for producing documentaries and producing content that will be aired or has been aired in the Argentinian TV. Their ultimate goal is to have China Global Television Network, the former CCTV, have a channel exactly in the same way as the Russians have, okay? But that's only on TV. Then we have they've been doing paying for supplements to be published along with some of the national newspapers. They've been trying, and sometimes successfully, in particular with the previous government, with Cristina Kirchner, that politically they had a very close relationship, to offer content, to offer the news service, Xinhua's news service for free to different Argentinian media. And that all of this that we could say it's not surprising, okay? Add to this one other example that is it's in the upcoming report, in which they've been able to, I don't know if you use this word, but you understand me, silence one of the most critical newspapers in Argentina. Because they were critical at the time when, because they were very critical with Cristina Kirchner. And because the deals between that government and China, they were also very critical with China. For the last 2.5 years, they've managed, with the strategy, to go ahead with this strategy led by the Chinese ambassador himself, going to the newsroom of this newspaper 4 or 5 times. Then suddenly they announce this deal with the People's Daily that nobody knows what's this deal all about. Then they are invited to some kind of forum related to the One Belt, One Road. This is just basically public relations, I guess, because nothing came out. Then this newspaper, with the change of the government, starts to have some financial troubles, also because they get involved in a TV project that doesn't work out very well. And what happens next? Some of the big Chinese state-owned companies advertise in this newspaper. Okay? It's difficult to relate one thing with the other, but this happened in a very short period of time. And unsurprisingly, this newspaper that for a long time was critical of China because of the deals that China was doing in Argentina, during the last, it's not only that criticism is now very unlikely in this newspaper, it's also that the Chinese ambassador has been able to publish 6 op-eds in the last 18 months. I don't know any serious newspaper, and this newspaper, it is a serious newspaper, that would allow the ambassador of any country, not to say if this country is an authoritarian regime, to give them the space to publish their propaganda 4 times per year.
I can see the same happening here in Europe. The Chinese are not just buying media, but they are giving material for free. This is happening in Reuters, where you can find free shooting and materials from CCTV. And of course it works, so not just in Latin America. Mr. Panda, please.
Yeah, let me actually relate both the things, the legitimacy question and the media questions. I think if you see the past and the history, how the Chinese Communist Party has successfully ruled the country for so many years, I think the key point is they have controlled the society, they have controlled the domestic China, they have controlled the immediate periphery near China. And that's how the Chinese Communist Party has survived. But one additional point, how the Communist Party has survived is what has already been pointed out is the splendid performance of economics. In last 3 to 4 decades, if you see, particularly since the Deng Xiaoping's 4 modernization strategy, they put agriculture and industry as the top 2 modernization drives. So as a result, the agricultural sector and the industrial sector started complementing each other. So from 21st century onwards, we saw China becoming an economic power. And the legitimacy of the Communist Party started surviving and started becoming to some form of legitimacy. Now, how is it going to govern in the future? I think if we talk about a little bit about future, I think the same strategy will be implemented by Communist Party in next couple of decades, at least if not for a long time. They will be controlling the economy. They would like to continue with the same splendid performance of economy, the GDP growth, the industrial sector and the agricultural sector complementing each other. As a result, you will see an Chinese economy prospering in future, and there will be the whole lot of attraction going to China. But I think the challenge here will be that in last century, we didn't see media coming as a challenge for China. In this century, we are seeing media coming as a challenge for China. And I think that is the differentiating point here. Even though China will continue to give double-digit growth GDP economy, and the economy will flourish, and maybe you will see maybe another 10, 15 years it is becoming the largest economy in the world, surpassing the American economy. I think that the challenge will remain the same, that the political reforms will not be supplemented by the economic reforms or the economic performances. And on the political front, I think apart from the normal political reforms, what China has been really losing out over the years, I think one of the most effective challenge will be how to restrict the youth, the young generation, not to believe in free media. And I think they are already facing a lot of challenge with regard to this, and this can be noticed on 2 fronts. One is that if you see, I think what has happened in China in last a decade or so, at least in last 10 years or so, a number of English media and Chinese media have come out. In all of those English media, be it China Daily, be it Global Times, be it Asia Times, and many provinces also have their smaller English booklet. But most of these media outlets today, I mean, the content of those media outlets are being written by the foreigners, but those foreigners are residing in China. And in a way, they are actually been fed by the Communist Party, by the officials, by the Chinese government in such a way that they are writing for China's promotion. And I think that is one of the concerns, that the whole world is being trapped inside China, how to follow a defined model of China, which has been set by the Communist Party. The second pattern, what we are seeing, is that the kind of writings which is coming in the Chinese media, and those kind of writings are actually linked with the China's foreign expansion policy. If I can give you an example, if you see China's problems with India in the last couple of years, I think a lot of provocative articles have appeared in Chinese media. Anti-India piece, how China has been really moderate towards India, and how India has been a problem for China all these years. On the contrary, what we saw is that those language and those publishing articles are not really written by the Chinese scholars. Those are written by the foreign scholars, and the Chinese government officials, the Chinese media houses has fed those ideas. Now, that is a problematic trend, because China wants to pass a good message to the outside world that it is being fair. But on the contrary, we know that it is not a fair. The decision-making process, the platform which they have employed within China is a problematic platform. And I think it will not continue for a long time. Today or tomorrow, somebody is going to break that platform. And I think already the Chinese youth are facing unrest. I mean, they are really feeling suffocated within China. They really want to believe in true knowledge, free media, and freedom of action, freedom of expression. And I think the Chinese government is really finding it hard to train the Chinese youth inside China. On the contrary, if you see, there is no incentive for these Chinese youths who are really want to work for China. So there is a contradiction in policy within China. And I think on a whole, we are seeing a problematic China emerging for the next couple of decades or so. One more additional point I would like to make here is that even though the Chinese economy will continue to do well, they will have more media which will pass the Chinese model of growth story to the outside world. I think world will slowly find it difficult to accept for few basic reasons. One, I think in China's neighbor, there is a successful democracy is there, which is known as the largest democracy of the world, that is India. And I think if we take the Indian case as an example, I think as a democracy, it is thriving for last 60, 70 years. And that has become a concern as a threat to the Chinese model of communism, Chinese model of rights. And if you see in the recent Doklam border tension, all the write-ups that appeared in the Chinese media and all the write-ups that appeared, the statements which was given by the Chinese officials, it was less related to the China-India boundary issues. It was more related towards India's rights, because they were seeing India's rights as a threat. So I come back to my first point I made initially, that India standing against China, both as a model, as a successful model, and as a neighboring prosperous country, is going to be a reference point for the rest of the world, for the regions. And I think that is also going to be a testing point for Chinese Communist Party and its legitimacy in future. People will be asking for transparency and legitimacy of the Communist Party today or tomorrow.
Let's hope. Thank you. We talk about that there is no long-term political future of country or in China. It was Mr. Xiao who pointed that. So I would like to ask if do you think that the Chinese do, or in which degree do they identify with the Xi Jinping Chinese dream, and how do they understand it? Mr. Xiao, please.
The Chinese dream is a slogan, right? Since Xi Jinping came up, and then his PR propaganda people come out, the slogan come with him, and going around to spread. It's just a slogan, okay? Even in the Chinese, and it's a bad slogan in the sense of, in the Chinese language, dream doesn't have, it has actually negative connotation. Yeah. Now, today, a lot of Chinese people will say, hey, wake up, don't just in your Chinese dream. Yeah, wake up to see the reality. But what is this slogan really about, right? It's about rousing the communism, the nationalism, of course. It's about actually responding to the question of whether China has a long-term political future or not. The dream is to provide some kind of vision, a powerful nation and a state, and tied together with your own personal happiness. Yeah. That's the sort of the idea behind of that slogan. But it's easy, well, it's not easy, it's not a word, but it's if you see through what it's trying to achieve, that you want to deconstruct that slogan, then you see the reality of China. That's why I say the full of anxiety and insecurity and fragile of the Chinese Communist Party. It's being reflected from the slogan. There's another slogan. The outside of China doesn't hear too much, but inside of China, the party sing a lot, called 3 confidence or 4 confidence. We're confident of our system, we're confident of our past, our model, we're confident about whatsoever. Okay, we're confidence. Do you understand the normal common sense is somebody say he's so confident, he must be really incompetent about it. He must have some confident anxiety attack, right? Which is exactly that happens. They say so much of a dream, confidence, but the reality is what it's trying to disguise and what trying to misguide.
Thank you. Now I can see that our time is running and we have a last 5 minutes if I'm right. So I would like to give a time for questions from audience. If there are any, just please raise your hand. The microphones are over there, they will bring it to you. And it will be nice if you can introduce yourself and ask in English, or if it will be necessary in Czech and I can translate, please. Thank you. The gentleman in the last row. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah. Hello, my name is Michal. I'm a tour guide here in Prague. And I have a question about, basically my question is, what is the West afraid of in its dealings with China? Because if you combine the population of the United States, the EU and Japan, it's roughly the same as China. And the combined economy, the GDP of these 3 countries, or like the EU is not really a country, but these blocks is much bigger than China's and will always remain bigger. And China is not going to catch up for decades with US, Japan and the EU combined. Why aren't the democratic countries of the world much more forceful in their dealings with China? I mean, what are they going to do? What's going to happen? What should I be afraid of as a Western leader? Thank you.
Do you want to ask someone particular, or so, Mr. Hugh, can I ask you maybe?
Should we collect all the questions because time is limited?
Okay, so there was another question, maybe, yeah, another 2. Okay, so the gentleman in the last row.
Yes, I think there's an awful lot of wishful thinking here. This idea that the Chinese model has no long-term future. I think if you actually look, for example, at the optimism of the Chinese people, 82% think that their children are going to live better than they are. In France, for example, it's 9%. In Germany, USA, it's in the 20s. The trust in government, you can say all these opinion polls are faked. I'm not sure. I think that it's more likely that politically Europe is going to be, the future of Europe is going to be more Chinese, and that the future of China is going to be more European. And I think, this conflict of ideologies and conflict of West and East. Lee Kuan Yew once said to Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, in the West you aim to protect the individual against the community, but in Asia our aim is to protect the community against the individual. And this is now, of course, coming to the forefront because we're going to live in an age of increasing climate collapse. And Western politicians say to me, we know what needs to be done, but we can't tell people how to live. And China, of course, has no compunction about telling people how to live. And even more and more people, even in Germany, are calling for a stronger state involvement in running the economy. So I think this sort of lack of faith in the West, in their own model, compared to the trust in China in their model, means that I think many of your predictions are actually, as I said, quite naive.
Okay, thank you. What was the question? I was lost a bit.
The question is
if we can trust China?
Yeah. that you believe that the Chinese model is heading for collapse. I think it's much more likely that the Western model is heading for collapse because it's going to be overwhelmed by the environmental crisis.
Maybe I should respond to that. I'm not making a prediction. Here I'm making observation. Observation that the Chinese elite, power elites, does not have confidence in their own political future. That's my observation. Secondly, then you're talking about this trust in the Chinese society, or Chinese people have a confidence or trust to the Chinese government. That will be it can be the biggest dictionary that describe Chinese society, Chinese people, that describing it. That will be the last word I will use. Trust? No. People had a deep distrust to the public authority in China. And I see that on the internet by observation. Again, it's not a statement.
Can I?
Yes, please.
May I? Yeah, regarding the trust issue, I don't trust the things that I know a lot, because I know there's a lot of loopholes, so I don't trust it. That means, we are holding it accountable, that authority accountable, right? But so, do you know in China, according to, because I'm a political science of Chinese politics, there is something called differentiated trust. People trust the national government highest. They trust the local government least. So there's a differentiation of the trust. Why? Because they know how corrupt the local authorities are. So they don't trust it. But they don't go to Beijing. They don't know how the government in Beijing is working. Guo Wengui said it's working in another way that you don't know, you don't understand at all. So and plus the fact that it spends a lot of money to polish its image, and it's so far away, like so far away from this area. Usually people are not that knowledgeable about how China is working. It's naturally that you have higher trust to something that seems very good, but actually you don't know how it works. So that's my answer to that question. Regarding to the previous question of, what was that?
The minister was asking about the power. Why the democratic countries are not against?
Why should the Western countries should be afraid of China? Because democracies are divided. They don't work together. That's the reason why we should have a conference here. So, as long as we're divided, we should be afraid. We should be worried. As I said, there's a nature of this regime. It's not accountable even within. So when it's expanding, everyone should be worried. I'm not against a rising China as long as it's accountable to its own people. And then then we can make it accountable to the rest of the world. It's transparent. As long as that kind of country expanding, it's a blessing.
Thank you. Mr. Panda, please.
Yeah, let me address to that question. A very interesting question, because that actually fits into the central theme of this forum 2000. I think how the Western countries or how the democracies needs to deal with China. We don't really need to contain China, because containment strategy with regard to China has failed. If we see the Americans, they have tried their best to contain China and they have failed. So the containment strategy with regard to China will never work, and we should not really be doing that. Second, we cannot really restrict China's rise, because China will bound to rise, and the kind of rise we are seeing, as we discussed in this forum, I think mostly we are seeing an economic rise of China. I think what we need to see and what we need to do is that whether each of these democratic countries in the world, particularly powerful democracies, they can set an example in confronting China, the kind of indiscipline, the kind of injustice China is doing to the regions or to the world. I think we need to set an example there, more than building an alliance. I think democratic alliance virtually exists in this world. And that's why we are having this forum, and that's why there is a lot of antipathy, lots of negativity towards China. I think we don't really need to build an alliance of democracies, because this alliance of democracies are actually existing virtually. What we need to do, that each of these democratic countries need to stand against China to challenge the China's wrongdoing. 3 examples. One, if we see recently the border tension between China and India, India was the country which stood against PLA. We crossed the India-China boundary. It was never in our history. We have always been a peace-loving country, but we have been the first country to challenge to the PLA that stopped the construction, and we crossed the India-China boundary to go to the Bhutanese territory to confront with the PLA, and the stand-up continues for 2.5 months. The second example, we are the only country to stand against China's Belt and Road Initiative. We did not really support on a platter the Chinese, whatever they were offering to us. I think India's opposition to Belt and Road initiatives has actually spread the good words around the world, that the world needs to critically examine the Belt and Road Initiative package. The kind of package the Chinese are offering on a platter, that's really something very, very negative, and very, it's a concern for the rest of the world. We need to really think about it wisely before accepting any Chinese package. Third, I think what we really need to do is that I think the China's activities in the maritime domains, I think probably it is too far-fetched a debate. We cannot at this point say that China is really confronting other countries in the Indian Ocean region, but the way the Chinese maritime activities are going on in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea, that definitely is going to be one of the strong signaling for the future, that we need to be really careful about it. Much credit goes to Philippines, because Philippines was the first country to stand against China in the Permanent Court of Justice. So we need examples like that on the maritime domains which can confront with the PLA Navy and with the Chinese military. And therefore, we don't really need an alliance of democracies. What we need, the democracies, each of these democracies setting an example, confronting the wrongdoing that China is doing. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I have to say that our time fled away. So thank you, our panelists, for sharing their opinions and ideas. And I would say, let's hope in the future, maybe future of China and change to better. Thank you.